Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror book sales in the UK are increasing, but it's not all good news. So one of my Discord members, John, posted a link to an article from The Bookseller the other day, which was really, really interesting. So this is an article talking about horror book sales and how they have increased. So horror book sales in the UK apparently have increased by 23% since last year, so 2024 over 2023. And 2023 apparently was already one of the best years ever. So horror book sales in the UK are increasing, and that's got to be a good thing. I do have some comments on this article and on this list, but at its heart, the fact for me that people are reading more horror is a great thing, and that makes me very, very happy as a lifelong horror fan. When you get into the list though of the top 20 books, it's quite interesting. So a couple of points to make about the list first of all. So firstly, they post in this article the top 20 best-selling horror books so far this year. It's not 20 though, so that's the first thing to know. It's actually 18 because two of the books are on this list twice. And that is because they've had both hardback sales that made the top 20 and paperback sales that made the top 20. So there are two different ISBNs for those two books. So it's actually a top 18 rather than a top 20. The other thing that's interesting about this list is they don't categorise it as the top 20 horror books. They categorise it as the top horror and ghost stories. And I've got no idea why publishers have made that distinction. So the Bookseller, if you don't know, is kind of like the trade magazine of the publishing industry in the UK. I don't know why they distinguish it that way, why they call it horror and ghost stories. But what's interesting about this list is there are a couple of books on here which are kind of like gothic thrillers, rather than what I would consider to be horror books. And you get into a whole question then about kind of genre and subgenre and things like that, don't you? I've seen videos recently from fantasy channels talking about the rise of romantasy as a subgenre of fantasy, and the fact that that's kind of crowding out sales of epic fantasy type books, and how sometimes publishers at the moment are looking for the next big romantasy book rather than looking for the next big epic fantasy book, and so there's less epic fantasy being published. So clearly the success of particular types of books within genres can influence the shape of the genre overall, and I think that's happening at the moment. There seems to be a big rise in the success of that kind of gothic style of story, which I do quite enjoy sometimes. It's not my favourite sort of horror, but anything that gets people reading, in my opinion, is a good thing. Right, so let's look at this top 20 then, and it's a really interesting top 20, and for me personally it's a very disappointing top 20 because very few of the books that are in this top 20 are new books. So let me go through the list. Let me give you some numbers first. So as I say, 18 books overall in this list. 7 of those books are by Stephen King. But interestingly, his newest book is not in this list. So King's 2024 release was You Like It Darker, which is a short story collection. That's not in this list, and it's not in this list because it hasn't sold well. It's in this list because they categorise it as short stories, so it's in the short story list rather than the horror list, which seems weird to me. So You Like It Darker is not in this list. If it was, King would have 8 books in this list, I suspect, rather than 7. 6 of the King books that are in this list are older books. So Holly is in this list, his 2023 release, which was released in paperback in 2024. So that makes this list twice at number 1 and number 10. So I can't remember I'm not sure which way around it is, but basically, both the hardback and the paperback are in this list. So they get separate rankings. So there's one newish Stephen King book, and then there are 6 older Stephen King books in this list. So those are The Shining, which is at number 3, It, which is at number 9, Carrie at number 11, Pet Sematary at number 16, and The Stand at number 20. So King really dominates this list. He's a third of the books on this list are Stephen King books, which is really disappointing. I mean, he's a great author. He is one of my favourite authors of all time. I think he's absolutely fantastic. But I also think it's a shame that he is crowding out, other other authors, newer authors in the horror space. And certainly if you go into a bookshop in the UK, certainly the bookshop in the small town that I live in, like the W.H. Smiths, if you go in there, the horror section is basically just Stephen King and a couple of other things. And I think King would be disappointed by that as well. King has always been a big champion of other writers. And I think he'd probably think it's a shame that one author, albeit that it's him, but one author is, dominating a genre in the way that he dominates horror. And I think he deserves to dominate horror. I think he's a phenomenally good writer of popular fiction, not just horror fiction. But I also think it's a shame. So King has six. There are six older books from King in this list. Some of them very old. Carrie is 50 years old this year. So a phenomenal achievement that a 50-year-old book is one of the bestsellers of the year, but still a shame. 6 of the other books on this list are older books as well. So those are The Woman in Black by Susan Hill, which is a great book, but and I understand why people are still buying it, but it's a shame that it's driving out newer authors. So that's at number 4. The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty is at number 2. So that is the second most successful horror book of the year, is a book that came out in the 70s. You've also got Dracula at number 6, Frankenstein at number 7, both fantastic books, but again, I wish people were reading newer horror. What else have we got? Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. So, old books, classic books, excellent books, but, they're driving out newer books. So you've got those. You've also got, as I said, a couple of Gothic thrillers. So let me go through the other books that are in this list that I haven't already covered. So you've got The Gathering by C.J. Tudor, which is the other book that makes this list twice. So that's at number 5 and at number 17. So I haven't read that. C.J. Tudor is an author I think of as being more of a crime writer, but looking at the cover of this book, certainly it looks like it's a vampire book. So it was on a deal on Kobo today. So I have bought it for 99p. I've just got it in before my Read What You Own challenge starts, so I will read that at some point and report back on that. Clearly, it's been very successful this year. You've then got The House That Horror Built by Christina Henry, which is a new book, 2024 release. Christina Henry, I haven't read anything by yet, but she's got a great reputation. She's supposed to be really good, so I should check that out at some point. So that's a book I'm pleased to see on this list. You've got The Witching Hour by Sid Moore, which is one of the Gothic type titles on the list, and which actually came out in 2011. So I don't know for sure, but I can only assume that this is one of those books that's kind of taken off on TikTok or something like that, and that's why it's made the list. It seems weird that a book that's not that well known, I would have said, I hadn't heard of it personally anyway, and is 13 years old. It feels weird that it's one of the bestsellers of the year. You've then got The Night House by Joe Nesbo, which I've read and talked about on the channel. I didn't particularly enjoy The Night House. I thought parts of it were great, but overall I didn't think it was that good. I suspect the reason that it's done so well is because Joe Nesbo is a well-known author. So, an author who's been very successful writing crime fiction, has a lot of fans, and I suspect some of those fans picked up The Night House despite the fact it was horror rather than crime, and that's why it's made the list. And then we have Monstrillo by Gerardo S. Cordova, which I have a copy of and have been meaning to read for ages, so definitely need to get to that. I'm very pleased to see that on the list because that's a book that I know a lot of people have really, really enjoyed. And then the final one is Our Hideous Progeny by C. McGill, which again is another Gothic one. So I think that is a newer release, but another kind of Gothic style story rather than what... I don't want to sound like gatekeepery or snooty about horror, but I do think of that kind of story as a slightly separate type of horror. It's kind of a crossover, isn't it, Gothic stuff between horror and romance, which is something I really enjoy. But yeah, interesting that, as I said, that there are 2 Gothic books that have made this top 20. So yeah, overall, I do find this a slightly disappointing list. There are far too many old books on here, far too few new books. And I don't know if that's because, it feels like there are more and more horror books being published at the moment. feels to me as a someone who's been a horror reader for decades, that there are more interesting horror books being published now than there have been at pretty much any time since the 80s. And maybe that's why there aren't more newer books on this list. Maybe there are, because there are a wide variety of different horror books being published. Maybe if you looked at the top 50, there'd be tons of, really good new horror books, but all with a similar number of sales. None of them quite getting enough to make the top 20. And I do get why, from a reader perspective, readers, gravitate to books and authors they've heard of. So it's probably no surprise that King and a load of classics are on this list. But yeah, I'm interested to know if anyone knows if top 20s for other genres look like this. So is the top 20 romance books, is that dominated by older books and by particular authors? Is that true for for thrillers and things like that? Is that true for science fiction? So if you know, do let me know in the comments, and also let me know what you think of this list. Are you a bit disappointed like I am, or do you think it's fine? Anyway, yeah, let me know in the comments. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.